Some artists learn to draw because they have 1,000,001 ideas they want to see. They learn to draw because they have ideas, and then other artists learn to draw, and then they struggle to find ideas for things to draw. And this is the problem that Samuel has. He left this as a comment, basically saying, hey, please, I can't stop just replicating what I see. I'm not good at using my imagination. How do you use reference? Where do you come up with ideas? While I'm chatting about this, you can watch me paint a Hearthstone card. I've painted Hearthstone cards since before it was Hearthstone. Jeez. And so I thought it'd be cool to just share the process here on my YouTube video. If you want to learn how I paint cards, I've done over almost 100 cards for Hearthstone now up to this point. And if you wanted to know my whole process and what goes into it and how you interact with the developers and all that sort of a thing, and what goes into designing a card for Hearthstone, well, I have a Hearthstone workshop. It's also a really great resource if you're just looking to improve your painting skills. If you're watching what I'm doing, you're like, I just want to know how the heck I can do that. That's available in my Hearthstone workshop over on my Gumroad channel. And it is all on sale right now for the big Black Friday sale, early Black Friday sale. So you can get 25% off if you use the code on the screen above. I thought this would be valuable to talk about because sometimes I actually get portfolios from people who basically copy my own designs, and they say, oh, I get your art style, but you're really just copying what you see. And I don't think that that's the way to get a job as a concept artist. When you are a concept artist in games, the whole point is that you need to come up with ideas. So this is an aspect of your creative development, your development as an artist and as a creative person. If you're going to make creativity your career, then you need to develop your formulas that you use. Your formula is like your recipe, the same way that KFC has a unique recipe for their breaded original style chicken. You need to work on your recipe. I can't give you an answer as to what your recipe should be because your recipe has to be different than what everybody else's recipe is. You need to be considering your formulas. I will give you some base level formulas that I use because I've talked about them a lot on my channel. And I also want to make sure that the next generation of creative concept artists are thinking creatively, that you're not just copying things that you've seen done before. Most artists, when you sit down to learn to draw, and this is not a bad thing, when you're learning something, you should be copying initially. You should be copying what you see. That's not stuff that should go in your portfolio, and that's not stuff that should go in the public eye even, unless if it's just that you're looking to get feedback, such as when you're doing anatomy studies or you're learning to draw basic forms or light forms. That's not so much about the creative side. That's not about finding your own unique take on it. It's like there are anatomical consistencies between humans, understanding those core fundamentals and construction of objects and how they fit into perspective, how to light them, how to render them. These are not things that you're supposed to necessarily get creative with until you're very, very advanced. Okay, so if you're in that stage where you're still trying to figure out anatomy, for instance, well, then you're probably going to be looking at a lot of reference. You're going to be copying. It's a lot of rote memorization until you have sort of 3D models in your mind. If you haven't drawn a character before, I can't just close my eyes and draw Mickey Mouse. I can't envision every element of how Mickey Mouse is constructed and the proportions of ears to the eyes and all that stuff. I would need to pull up an image of that. In fact, throughout this part of the video, you're going to watch me pull up reference for this character that I have to draw because it needs to look like what the plague spreader looks like in the World of Warcraft universe. I can't just glance at it once and then reproduce that. No artist really can, unless if you have maybe a photographic memory or if it's something that you've drawn many times over. I designed parts of Silver Moon City for the actual World of Warcraft video game. But when I'm tasked with designing or drawing a illustration for Silver Moon City in the background of this Plague Spreader card, for instance, I have to pull up reference because it was freaking 17 years ago. Okay. I don't remember, is that permanently etched in my mind? I don't have an exact replica in my mind of what even some of my own designs were. And on top of that, when you're a concept artist, you have to do multiple iterations. You're not always sure which ones they go with for the final when they build the 3D models. But a lot of times I think that people get this impression that the creativity has to come from your imagination. And the imagination, in I think many people's mind, is sort of like, well, I can't just think up something. I can't just close my eyes and envision something and then put it to paper or put it down without being completely off. And I think that we need to take a step back and reverse that. Start with the need. I'm going to say that again. Start with the need. Why does this drawing need to exist? Start with a story. Start with something that is required to conceive. That's just a complicated way of saying, like, let the needs of the drawing become the creativity. You might do this in any direction that you might ask yourself to just go, well, what would I like to see? You know, would I like to see maybe a Final Fantasy character 20 years after Final Fantasy VII happened? Just as an example, like, do your own sort of formula for what you would like to see, but that's one way to just sort of trigger some creativity in yourself. Because I found most of what creativity is really just what if questions. It's scenarios. It's asking yourself, what if this story element happened to this character? What would they look like? And then problem solving it as you're sketching it out, using all the fundamentals of anatomy and perspective and all the things that we learn about in our fundamentals of drawing. You have to think of them as almost separate things. Just learning to paint is one thing, but learning to paint something creative and imaginative is sort of almost a separate discipline. Get yourself thinking imaginatively about a what-if situation. Now, if you're working from the ground up, it still follows a similar kind of a thing. You're still working with formulas. As is the case with concept art, the function determines the design. This is where so many people get concept art wrong. They don't understand it. It's never talked about, except here on my channel, actually, from what I could tell. But the function determines your design. It's not the other way around. So when you're working as a concept artist, a designer, a game designer, will come to you and tell you, this is what this enemy does. This is their attack. This is their defense. This is how they maneuver the environment. You start to design based on the need, the function. So they might even say, well, this character needs to be small. This character needs to be large. They will kind of tell you some of those things. So the function then determines your design decisions, because a character who's small and agile and moves quickly is going to be smaller and more agile looking. You need to have those elements implemented into the design itself. It's not that a character designer just gets to design whatever they want and then design figures out, the gameplay designers figure out how to make that work in game design. No, it doesn't go that way. But not all of us have a game designer saying, hey, well, this is what I need. So if you're just coming up with something creative, let's go off on that exploration together. Let's write our own story for a simple, basic formula for our design to get our formula started. And you can add to this formula as you develop your own. Let's say that you are designing a character, okay? A character, let's give him a story before we even sit down to draw him. Instead of looking at something cool and going, ooh, I want to be able to do that, instead start with the character, the story. So this is a character who is a desert wanderer. In our completely hypothetical sort of experiment that you could draw, you could actually do this yourself. Let's go one step further and say that this is a desert wanderer who is a warrior in a hostile land. There are hostile enemies around them. A desert wanderer who is a warrior will have things like, probably a sword or a weapon of some sort made of a material that would be available in the desert. If the character is surviving sandstorms, they're going to have a cloak that covers their face. They're going to maybe even wear goggles, depending on the era in which they exist. All of these things are going to inform the design, and those things that inform the design are going to be very distinctly different than, say, a tundra mage, somebody who is surviving in a wilderness, a cold, frozen tundra, and maybe they're a magic user. They're not going to carry a sword. They're not going to need goggles to cover their eyes from sandstorms. They're going to have a very different kind of coloration in their even in their design of their outfits. So for instance, a warrior who is fighting with swords is going to probably wear armor, or possibly wear something that protects them from being attacked by whatever is in their environment. Let your environment, let your story of your characters design it for you. That is where imagination is going to come from. It's going to come from necessity. It's going to come from the story that you're creating. So come up with a character. It's not even, that part doesn't have to be that original. You could just, for instance, say like, okay, this is a character who is like a Batman, okay, so vigilante, but maybe instead of using the bat as their symbol, they come up with another type of animal that's scary, and then you start to think in terms of like, okay, so how do they represent that in a symbol on their body? What are they doing? Are they flying? Are they jetpacking around? What kind of technology and gizmos do they have? And how might a person who is a crime fighter, just in this hypothetical, how might they use things that are thematic to the creature or the symbol that they represent? You know, how might they use that in their devices that they use, or in their costuming, or in their abilities? And what kind of a backstory could you create that's synonymous with that, that represents that? And this is the problem solving that I was talking about earlier. Creativity is just problem solving from an interesting notion, or even sometimes inconvenient situation, such as trying to smash together two things that really should not belong together at all. This is the essence of creativity, and it's in its purest form. And the deeper you think about this, and the more clever you are about answering those questions and solving those problems, the more people will look at your designs and think that it's really compelling or really interesting and creative. This is where the creativity comes from. It's not from something that you've closed your eyes and envisioned. It's not from some magical, mystical place. It comes from necessity of the story. It comes from what is important to the story. So this goes even one step further if you're working on something that's very narrative driven, if it's a character from a novel. So this kind of a thinking, this kind of formula building is going to be the groundwork for where a lot of your concepts and ideas are going to come from. This is totally separate from your thinking about color and light, okay? The trinkets your character wears, the kind of colors that they have in their armor or their robes or whatever it is that you're designing on them. All of those things come from this short little summary of what their function is. What's their personality? That's going to affect how they stand and the kind of outfit that they wear. If they're very militant, they're going to have very clean clothes, very clean, orderly type of uniform almost. But if they're savage and they're living in the Badlands and they're just fighting for survival every day, they're going to have different weapons attached, maybe daggers hooked to their belt, things like that. Those are the sorts of things that are going to create your creative characters, your creative monsters and creatures. What do they feed on? How do they eat? What do they hunt? Thinking about this, how do they trick their prey? When you look at nature, when you look at humans, we do this on the macro scale, such as, what are religious symbology that a culture might adopt to create the weapons that they use, or the purpose behind what they fight for. They might have those symbols embedded into their cloaks and all over their outfits, all the way down to the more of the micro, where you've got animals and how animals will adapt to camouflage themselves into an environment, or they might develop a shell to protect themselves because they're herbivores and they need to protect themselves from carnivore attacks. Everything about our world comes from a necessity. Nature, by definition, is not necessarily creative, although it is the most creative force in the universe that we know. Just nature will evolve into a sustainable, livable design. Humans are fascinating to design for because we have intellect, we have creativity. think creatively in the mindset of a person from a different era. So, for instance, a Viking will design an axe very differently than, say, a Native American would design an axe. They have different resources available to them. The things that they hunt or that they try to kill would have it would require a different shape in the axe, a different kind of construction. And so here's a great thing for you to practice is exactly that. Put yourself in the headspace of something that's existed, a Native American, for instance, and design a weapon for a Native American. Like, here's a fascinating experiment. What would have happened if Native Americans continued to develop technology? What would have happened? How would they have developed their weapons, and how would they have grown to fight against the things that were a danger to them in their environment, or the kind of animals that they were hunting, for example, and then as a personal experiment, move on to the next one. Like, okay, so what about Vikings? Like Viking technology in modern era, what would a Viking tank look like if they would have just developed the same kind of logic? Okay, so they had like a lot of these sort of patterns and a sort of religious symbology in the ancient things that we found from the Norsemen, right? So how would that have evolved if they would have developed into an industrial age? Like, this is all exciting, crazy, fun stuff, man. This is like what I love about doing concept art for video games, is that you get to explore all of that stuff. You get to go wherever the hell you want. And this is the whole point of learning to be able to draw well, is to communicate these ideas clearly and to sift through the possibilities. I can literally design 50 axes for what it would look like if it was a modern axe designed by a Viking, if they had continued into the industrial age and beyond into modern era. How freaking cool is that? And I'm not just talking about people, and I'm not just talking about animals, I'm talking about environments too. When you design a structure, what is its function? How do people who live there survive? Do they have predators? Do they have to put up any kind of defenses? If they do, then what kind of a thing is attacking them, and how would they defend themselves using the resources that they have in their environment? Did they steal some resources from a neighboring village, or is it modern day, or is it futuristic? And what are the needs of those people in that environment? All of these things are part of the formula that I'm talking about. This is where ideas come from. And when you start to train your brain to think this way, it just goes off on tangents, and it's infinite. It can go in a million directions. And as time changes, and as the vision of our own culture becomes more clear into the present, as you're constantly future thinking and anticipating trends and where things are going, you can find an infinite number of things to draw. And this is imagination. This is creativity. It's not because I close my eyes and I see it complete. It's because I'm pulling at a thread, and that thread is leading to a conversation, and that conversation is exciting and interesting. So train yourself to think this way, and you'll never run out of ideas. And while you're doing that, don't neglect that you need to improve your rendering ability. You need to improve your composition. You need to improve your color theory, your perspective, all of the fundamentals. You'll need to study anatomy. And that might require that every now and then you have to pull up a reference image of a character that's got his arm at the angle of the drawing that you're already doing, because your story, the thread that you had been pulling on, requires that you look up a character, a warrior with a sword over their shoulder, for example. So you're going to pull up reference of a body, of a warrior with a sword over their shoulder. And you're going to look at that and use it just as a guide for the gesture and for the shape, or maybe the anatomy. Or maybe the character's wearing some kind of a leather belt, and you just need to reference the materials. How do I render that leather in the style that is believable for the universe that I'm creating? And so start with your story first. In fact, it might be helpful for you, before you sit down to draw anything, to write out a little paragraph or even a one sentence about what it is that this thing is that you're drawing, and let the story carry you away. And only pull up reference as it's needed based on what your story was. Don't go the other way around. A lot of artists will just start with the image and then try to cook up a story around that. No. Go the other way around. Start with your story, then look up reference based on what you need. Of course, if you're still struggling with the fundamentals of drawing, check out my Easy Art Lessons series. This starts you from not being able to draw at all and teaches you everything that you're going to need to know to be able to communicate these wonderful characters and worlds that you're creating. I also have a number of more advanced tutorials that teach you everything that I know about designing environments and characters for video games, like what you've seen me do on a lot of the games that I've worked on throughout the last 20 years. I'm looking to pass that info on to you. Of course, if you want that discount, you can use the code on the screen above. And if you're just looking for a little bit of inspiration every week, I have videos similar to this here on my YouTube channel. So don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. All right, I'll see you guys in the next one. Ciao.